All right, welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining for this industry student engagement session, a key component of the State of Innovation Challenge. My name is Jenny Six. I'm on the team leading the challenge, and I'm joined today by Arielle Dreher, a reporter with the Spokesman-Review. So today we are going to learn a little bit more about the day-to-day being a reporter. We'll learn more about Arielle's career path and how work has changed since COVID happened. And then we'll learn a little bit more about Arielle's advice on approaching the State of Innovation Challenge prompts. Thanks for joining us, Arielle.
Thanks so much for having me.
So to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit more about your role and your title?
Definitely. So, my technical title is Rural Healthcare Reporter at the Spokesman-Review, although that's sort of before the pandemic even broadened out. So, I was covering anything healthcare related east of the Cascades was sort of fair game for me to cover. And I've been at the Spokesman for about a year and a half now. In June will be 2 years.
And how has that changed over time, that experience?
Well, so from June 2019 to about January 2020, I was out in different parts of different counties, covering how rural health looked different than urban health, covering all sorts of different things. And then when the pandemic hit, it sort of all shifted, and suddenly COVID-19 was my beat and everything that I wrote about. So I've been on the COVID-19 beat for about a year now, since the first case of COVID-19 was confirmed in Washington state and in the country.
There is so much content out there about COVID. It feels like an ocean of information. So, as someone producing some of that information, how do you guide readers through sort of wading through the ocean to find the stuff that's really helpful and things that can be trusted?
Definitely. It has been a really interesting past year for those reasons. Journalists always are wading through lots of different types of information. I say that to be a good journalist, you really have to be a lifelong learner. You have to be interested and curious about things and how things work. Pandemic was fascinating and it continues to be fascinating because everyone is learning in real time. So that includes a lot of the experts that journalists typically call on or rely on for information. So previously, if I was reporting on something like addiction or mental health, I would call a, trained psychiatrist or a trained counselor and talk to them about their methods, what they do, what the research says is what is good and what's not good. Um, with COVID-19, because it's a novel or new virus, everyone more or less was starting on the same page. Now, there are experts who study coronaviruses, so they were very helpful to me at the beginning of this. But as we move forward, we didn't know what this virus was going to do. We didn't know how it was going to spread, how it was going to move. Initially, if you'll remember, we weren't even told to wear masks for a couple months. Um, and so I will say the pandemic has been a different type of information gathering process because it changes so much. And I think one of the things that was really important for me, um, as I began writing, and I think I got better at this as the pandemic went on, but really letting my readers know and being honest with them that, like, this is the guidance for now. um, and I know it's hard because oftentimes journalists are pointed to as like, oh, well, they're the truth tellers. Like they will always, they'll always like sift through everything and like just the facts. Well, the reality is this pandemic has shown us that like the science and the facts can change rather rapidly. Um, and it's been equal parts exciting, but also just a little bit nerve wracking, to be honest, to completely sort of every day I log on, I'm learning new information and sort of sifting through and wading through, what's important and what's not. And to be clear, I'm not doing that alone. I'm bouncing ideas off of all of my sources still, but it's the first time that I really remember, at least in my lifetime, sort of learning with my sources, right? Like I'll bring up something to a health officer or a doctor, and they'll say, "Yeah, I saw that study too. That's really interesting. We're not really sure how that's going to go." Um, and so I think that has been different because there are oftentimes stories and conclusions that I just can't come to. The answer of or the kicker of a story is we still don't know. And like
Right.
that's obviously like a really frustrating bummer, but I also think it's kind of neat to be a journalist because I have the ability in the writing to be transparent with the reader and just say, look, like this doctor doesn't know, this doctor doesn't know, to be determined. And so it's really important when you're reading things throughout the pandemic to pay attention to language because, like,
Hmm.
the words like likely or it might are like very important. Those are journalists telling you that things are not conclusive.
Hmm.
Um, and trust me when I say it's just as frustrating for us as it is for you reading.
Yeah, well, and I want to circle back to something you said earlier that, like, as a truth teller, it's important to be honest when you don't know or when there isn't an answer. And I think that that's a really important takeaway for a lot of industries. Um, but sort of knowing what you don't know and being honest about that and transparent about that to the extent you can sounds like it's a really important skill and trait in your field.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing, and we can probably talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the case challenge, but the other thing that has completely changed during the pandemic is because the entire international scientific community is trying to nail down and figure out this virus, we have for the first time, well, I think for the first time in this type of volume, I was talking to an expert about this, in this amount of papers and research, we have a lot of not peer reviewed studies out there.
Mhm.
Um, and as a journalist and as a healthcare reporter, I'm reading them and looking at them. But again, it's really important to let your readers know that these are preliminary studies. Like
Mhm.
they might all end up being confirmed eventually, but for right now, they're like the fresh data that we have, and that's about it.
Right,
And that's sort of what it is.
right.
So it's interesting because it's not just the journalist having to sort of disclose that, but it's also the scientists in real time being like, well, these are the results we got for now, but no one has come behind them and looked at their process yet.
Right, like the best answer right now might be different than the best answer in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So sort of circling back to you, take us through. I know that probably isn't a typical day, but take us through a day. What does a day look like for a reporter at the Spokesman Review?
Definitely. And I'll start with like what my days were like pre-pandemic because I think that's a little more emblematic of what a typical journalist goes through. So typically, I'm constantly making appointments, scheduling interviews. When we're not in a pandemic, I love going to people's offices, going to people's homes, meeting people, at coffee shops to have a conversation. So a typical day, like when I'm in my when I'm in my zone, when I'm having a really good week, I've had tons of interviews scheduled throughout the day. So sometimes that means I don't even get into the office until about noon or so. And my editor just knows, okay, Arielle's out talking in the community, or she's, planned to go to a rural hospital 2 hours away. And so she's like, she got up this morning and just started driving. Um, that is like my favorite part of my job is that your job as a journalist is to mold your schedule to everyone else's schedule. And sometimes that means like, yep, you're working on the weekend. And sometimes that means you're working really early or really late. Um, but in order to connect with people and be able to get people to tell you their stories, meeting with them face to face and like having interviews and conversations is a big part of the job. Um, so that is, in a typical day, I could have anywhere between one or zero interviews to, five or six. When I was doing trips for rural health reporting, I would sort of plan those in advance. So it would sort of be known, okay, Arielle is going to be gone for the rest of the day to go out to, Ferry County or Lincoln County. Um, so interviews are a big part of it. Another part of a typical day is, when you do get into the office, you sort of need to go through your email inbox. Unfortunately, this job too requires you to spend some time in front of a screen. And emails are really good. I set up interviews that way. I um, send out interview requests that way. You'll send out a lot of emails as a journalist and get no responses from them. So you got to be prepared for that. So email is a big part of it, and then also just being in the newsroom, you're sort of learning what in my case at a daily newspaper, you're sort of learning what's going in the paper the next day as you're in the office. And so if a story I'm working on is going in the paper, at some point I have to get back to the office to um, write it and also to let my editor know sort of how it's shaping up. Things change constantly as the pandemic has taught everyone, but specifically in newsrooms, things change hour to hour. If another story breaks and my story that is evergreen, meaning it can last and like it'll still be interesting and relevant in 3 days, my story might actually be held for 3 days. So pre-pandemic, being in the newsroom was good for that because there's a lot of teamwork that goes on just amongst reporters and having editors next to us. So that's a big part of the job as well. And then obviously, after I've done all the reporting and I'm out in the community doing interviews, I got to come back and transcribe and write. um, and that is a large part of the job. Transcribing typically means, if I'm out in the community and I ask people to record the interview, I come back and I listen to it and I type it all out. Some journalists don't do that. Some journalists are super old school and just do the notebook and pen. It just depends on the writer and the process and that type of thing. But transcribing is a really big part of the job. And I think that a lot of journalists would say it's their least favorite part because you're sort of just stuck typing words. So yeah, those are sort of the main elements of the job. And then obviously meeting the deadline. So, being able to analyze information, especially if your story is going to be in the paper the next day, you do have a set amount of time that you need to get it done by. So at some point during the day, you usually cut yourself off, or your editor does, and say, nope, time to start writing. You have a deadline at 5 or you have a deadline at 6, like it's time to go. So, that's sort of the daily process, if you will. Pre-pandemic, my beat, which just means health. In my case, my beat is healthcare, and beats are just what journalists call their area or their lane that they report on. Um, Previously on my beat, I didn't necessarily write a story every day. Healthcare is a little bit more, more of a relaxed beat in the sense that I could take my time with a story. And if I was writing about a rural hospital, I could go to several if I wanted to. Um, Obviously, the pandemic changed that. And I have become a daily reporter now. So that's been a really big switch and adjustment for me. And frankly, for a lot of the sources and people that I talk to regularly, because we used to have a couple days to set things up, figure out how to get a photographer to come with me. And now I'm calling them and saying, hey, I need something in 2 hours. So the pandemic has adjusted that to some extent. But that's sort of, pre-pandemic, that's what my days would look like. And I think with the pandemic now, the big difference is I'm obviously sitting on my couch in my apartment. We have not gone into the office since March 2020. We've been working from home. And for a lot of my stories, I really don't see people in person anymore, especially when I'm talking to people that are at risk for developing disease. If I can get everything that I need to get from them from a phone call or a Zoom, um, personally, I just don't feel like I need to be seeing them and potentially exposing them to the virus that I'm writing about every day. So that has been the biggest part of how my job has changed. And honestly, it's a bummer because a lot of our language is body language, right? Someone can say something on the phone, but if I was sitting in front of them, I might interpret what they're saying completely differently. So that has been really hard and something the pandemic has made more challenging and something I miss and frankly look forward to in the coming years.
Yeah,
Getting
I'm
back to.
sure. So I feel like what I'm hearing is that a lot of your job is relationship building and like earning trust with your sources. And that, like you said, that's hard to do when you don't have the context, when you're not sharing space with them, when you can't really see their body language. But it also sounds like it has translated into the virtual work world as well, that it's still critical to convey trust and to earn trust. It's still critical to be interested and able to soak in a ton of information at once. That's a big thing that you sort of alluded to a couple of times. And the other one, it sounds like, is adaptability, whether it's, working your interviews in or like figuring out your travel. or moving around your deadlines based on what else is going on. It sounds like sort of being able to stay calm amidst the chaos is a reoccurring theme in your day-to-day.
That's a wonderful slogan. I want that on a t-shirt. Calm, calm against the chaos. Yeah, no, journalism is all about flexibility and adaptability. And I think, it's a great career for people who think they might just get bored doing the same thing every day, because you won't do the same thing every day. And in fact, you'll plan a day, and then it's very possible your editor will call you and say, no, you need to drop everything and go do this for your day. So it's certainly a great job for folks that are willing to sort of be adaptable to anything and flexible. But also, I think like the big hallmark of journalism too is curiosity. I mentioned being a lifelong learner, but I think the other key element of being a journalist is you have to just be curious, and we're not all super nosy people, although most journalists probably are, but you have to be curious and interested in what makes people tick, why the government agency wanted to spend money on that contractor. Um, all good stories come from a series of questions that usually aren't answered truthfully or aren't answered at all. And I think, having that sense and like just desire to answer those questions is a really important part of being a journalist too.
Yeah, and like thinking back, a lot of the youth who are participating in the State of Innovation are middle school age, high school age, or out of school youth, sort of within that age range. Thinking back to your time during that age, are there experiences or classes or anything else that sort of cued to you that you might have that curiosity or the lifelong learning interest, or something that guided you towards the role that you're now in?
Definitely. I really liked stories when I was in middle school and high school. I read a lot as a kid, but I also did theater. So I liked the storytelling component of theater and books. I was definitely, probably since middle school, like more inclined and more just more successful in my like English and writing courses than I was necessarily my math or science courses. Although, just because not all journalists are like that. I just want to say that out loud. There are really, really good data journalists out there that English was not their thing, math and science was totally their thing, and our industry needs both kinds of people. So I just want to, you don't have to just be an English nerd to be a journalist. That's not what I want to communicate.
You can be a theater
Um,
nerd and be a journalist.
yeah, yeah, exactly. You can be any type of nerd. Truly, if you have nerd attached to any of your titles, like you probably can write about it and like investigate it and report on it. There are all types of reporters. There are reporters who write about TV shows. There are reporters who write about government corruption and everything in between. Um, I did do newspaper in high school, and I know a lot of high schools don't have newspapers anymore, but I don't think that that should deter you from, if you're interested in writing or becoming a journalist, like don't be discouraged if your high school doesn't have a newspaper. There are other things out there and ways for you to get your writing out there. I remember I grew up in the Tri-Cities, and I think it was our local community college had like a high school writing competition. And I submitted, it was more of like a nonfiction essay. It wasn't really journalism. I didn't interview anyone. It was written from my perspective and my experience. And I won that essay competition. And for me, that was sort of like the catalyst, if you will, being like, oh, I can do this. Like I can write. Like this is exciting. And I don't know. Again, I just want to encourage students that had nothing to do with journalism. Like that writing competition was just, sort of had a basic prompt, and I just wrote from my own personal experience and I won. And that was sort of what for me was like, oh, Arielle can write sometimes. Okay. And
Well,
sort of
it seems like
like,
the trend there is no matter what the circumstances, if you want to write, find a way to write, like find a way to get your writing out there, whether it's newspaper, whether it's a competition. COVID might actually have opportunities that were not there before, like State of Innovation Challenge, if you want to do a writing assignment there.
mhm.
But like get your writing out there seems to be the theme across that.
Absolutely. And I also think I wanted to make this point too that uh, your writing is not going to, like, my writing a year ago, I read now and I'm like, ooh, I don't know about that. We like writer, like in my experience, like the best writers and the best journalists are constantly getting better. And eventually um you'll find your style and your rhythm. But like just don't be discouraged if writing isn't your thing right now or you feel like you have a lot to learn and you're not great at it. Like do not just like say, well, no, journalism's not for me. It can be learned. It's a very like attainable skill and you can acquire it down the road. So don't let that discourage you if you just don't like writing.
So you had this competition, and now you're at the Spokesman-Review. What happened in between? How did you get to your current role?
Right. I lived a lot of different places after then. So I grew up in the Tri-Cities and I left the state for college. I went to Azusa Pacific in California and I studied, ended up getting a degree there in journalism and in English. I dropped my theater major, but you don't have to. You don't have to. But and then after, when I was close to being done with that program, well, I guess I should say a part of my curriculum at APU, they required an internship. And this was back what I hope is in now a not an ancient time that does not exist anymore, but when we were doing internships for credit, we didn't have to be paid. And I'll sort of bookmark that and I'll come back to that in a second because I don't think that my experience has to be anyone's experience to get to where I am today. Um, but my degree required an internship and we didn't have to be paid for it. I think you could be, but you didn't have to be. But because I didn't have to be paid, I was able to sort of put out feelers to a few papers and see if anyone would take me. And I essentially a journalist in training wanting to like work for you for X amount of hours during the summer. And of course I applied to like the big name internships at the Seattle Times and the LA Times and I did not get them. And I wrote to the editor at the Everett Herald and they did let me come. And so I worked at the Everett Herald in the summer of 2012, 2013, 2013. And they welcomed me in. I was there part-time, I think 2 or 3 days a week. And that's where I got my first clips as a journalist, while I was still a college student. And um, I maintain to this day the best place to learn journalism is in the newsroom, is sort of just by being assigned a story and them saying, all right, we need it by 6, and you just got to go. And you got to go, you got to knock on doors, you got to go to the event, you have to talk to people. Sort of baptism by fire, being thrown in the pool are both really good analogies. And so that's how I learned. That summer was my first time in a newsroom and the first time I was published on a front page. And I just learned how one newsroom worked, but also learned how journalism worked. And it was a really fun time. And that internship was almost like a test case for me to see if I enjoyed it, if I liked that hustle. Then after college, I would definitely start looking at journalism jobs. I decided to go to grad school instead, and I went to the journalism school at Columbia University after APU immediately. So I just sort of went straight from undergrad to grad school. And I'll just like put this caveat out there that you do not need to go to grad school to be a journalist. You do not, you do not, you do not. As someone who has a master's degree and is very thankful for it, I just need to tell you, you don't have to go to grad school to be a journalist. But I did, and I ended up publishing a few stories while I was in grad school at some bigger papers. Um, but ultimately, grad school for me was sort of about figuring out what type of journalist I wanted to be. And I really have always been drawn to doing longer stories. I like hanging out with people for months at a time or researching something in the archives for months at a time until I find like the one document that I was looking for. And the type of paper that sort of accommodates that type of writing is called an alt weekly. And so my goal, sort of by the end of grad school, was to get into one of those alt weeklies and be able to work um, at one of those papers, which was sort of a pipe dream for me because I had no experience doing that. Even though I'd been in grad school, that was really nice. Like tap tap, you have no chops writing a 6,000 word story. What do you think you're doing? But I got really lucky, and in the midst of a career fair, I interviewed for a job at the Alt Weekly in Jackson, Mississippi. And I ended up being one of the only reporters that she interviewed that like actually was willing to move to Jackson, Mississippi after grad school. So I will say, and I think this is true regardless of how you get to journalism, your first job is probably not going to be where you would ever imagine. And I have to tell you that that's a great thing, because the best stories are not in the middle of New York City. They're just not. The best cities are not in the middle of Los Angeles. The best stories are probably the stories in these tiny towns that you've never heard of, that you will only get to go to if you are willing to go there and see what's out there. And so I think, and one of my favorite grad school professors gave me that advice too. He always said, go to the boonies, like go out, like get out of the cities and go out and find stories. And he was absolutely right. So I stayed in Jackson for 3 years at that alt weekly. And I came home in the summer of 2018 to be closer to family. I'd been gone from Washington State for a really long time at that point. Um, and I started to interview for jobs. I freelanced. I moved to Spain. I was still freelancing and sort of doing like several jobs at once. And then I applied for the position sort of backwards, but I applied for Report for America, which is the journalism job program, sort of, and volunteer corps. And that's what ended me back at the Spokesman-Review. So it was very lucky, very sort of backwards way of coming home to Washington State. And I've been here since June 2019. So my story is probably very abnormal and unique, but I think the really important things are: one, you do not need to go to grad school to be a journalist. Two, interning anywhere is a really good idea. And you don't even have to intern to freelance at a paper. And I think that's important. And when you're um, living in communities and working in communities, there's always a community paper, even if it's small, that probably needs content. And I'm not saying, again, I don't encourage doing internships for free or working for free, but I do think there are a lot of smaller community newspapers that are always in need of more content and more writers. And so if you have the opportunity, I had a cousin who also wrote for her like smaller town paper while she was working other jobs. So those options are out there. And sometimes it's as simple as an email. And that's how I ended up being able to freelance and move abroad, is because when I moved home, I emailed the editors at my local newspapers in the Tri-Cities. So, kind of like journalism, it's a little bit about relationships and networking for yourself, but you got to put yourself out there and, try to get your name into some papers and then go from there, if that makes sense. And then I think the other big takeaway is, when you are applying for jobs, be willing to go anywhere. And I mean anywhere in the country if you want to do this to
Well,
start.
especially now when you're probably starting remotely, I think maybe that'll give folks a different set of options. I
Totally.
appreciated you saying that like you've had your journey and it's been a really interesting sort of squiggly one, even though it's been a direct line through the journalism and reporting world. And also saying that like other people in your world have had very different experiences, and like the sort of the footholds for you don't have to be the footholds for other people. We've heard that from a lot of our industry leaders, that they're like, this is my story, this is how I got here, but my colleagues, my peers, have had very different ones, and you can get here as well.
Yep. Yep. No, absolutely. And I just like, I cannot say that enough, that like the takeaway from hearing me speak should not be go to grad school. It should be, find out what your local, if you're interested in journalism, what does your local journalism scene look like? And
Mm-hmm.
read it and see how they write and see if you can freelance or see if you
Mhm.
can like go out to coffee with a journalist and talk to them about what they do.
Mhm.
Those local connections are honestly just as important, if not more important, than schools or anything on your resume. And clips, meaning, if you have published stories in newspapers, are sort of the name of the game as well.
Yeah, it really sounds like it's all about leaning into that curiosity that so many reporters have and finding some way to practice, whether it's a blog or a community paper or something bigger or an internship, but find a way to practice because you're saying that like your writing evolves even as a professional reporter now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know so many good journalists that hustled for so long, working 3 or 4 different jobs and publishing stories when they could. I don't think anyone really comes to this profession in a traditional way. Like, there are so many different avenues to come to journalism now, um, which is important because for so long it was very much so just like a top down, very white people driven industry. And to some
Mhm.
extent, it really still is. But there are cracks in those walls, and that's really exciting. And I think that a lot of journalists, and I would put myself in this group, are really fighting to ensure that other people who might have traditionally not had access to become journalists are, because
Mhm.
that's the only way all these stories are told.
Right. Right. Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned a lot was the energy and the ethos of the newsroom, and I'm sure that must have changed with COVID as well. So what does a newsroom look like in 2021?
It's a lot of Slack messages. It's a lot of phone calls. It is harder because, previously we might all just be at our little cubes in the newsroom and I could just stand up and be like, hey, you, like, do you have a contact for this person at this organization? And now that's a text or a Slack message,
Mhm.
which obviously interpersonally is a lot harder.
Right.
And even in my position too, and just sort of how my role changed during the pandemic, I often would coordinate a lot with our graphic designer and illustrator to make sure that our graphics were also reflecting the science, reflecting what the story said, those types of things. Those things are so easy to do in the newsroom. I can just walk to her office and like it's perfect, right? I just walk over, I'm like, here are the details. I might have a couple suggestions or switches in a second. That's great. A couple minutes later, she'd bring me a proof and I'd like go, we could work so easily together. Now it's really hard. It's like, it's a phone call, it's her having to send me screenshots. It's I would be lying if I said it wasn't like pretty challenging. It can it can be frustrating, and I think there's a lot of folks out there, not just journalists, who, there's lots of Zoom meetings happening that if we were in the office, they'd be like 2-minute conversations that are
Mhm.
turning into like 20-minute Zooms. Um, so that sort of new sort of time management has been really hard.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, I'm not wasting any time driving to a lot of these places. Although I still am, like I'm still going on some reporting trips, still attending some events if I like need to see how a vaccine site looks or those types of things. I am still going in person to some of those things, but like I said earlier, a lot of that in-person stuff has just been, you know, me right here on Zoom or me right here on my phone. So I guess the time trade-off has sort of balanced out that way.
Mhm. Well, and it's interesting because right now a lot of folks who are in middle school or high school or other programs right now are actually having that Zoom training and that virtual communication training and like relationship building training virtually because you're right, that's a totally different ballgame than being able to share space with someone. So it's another sort of leg up that today's youth might have that the folks who are already in the field sort of had to learn on the job.
Right. Well, and I've been thinking about this a little bit too. Um, I because I'm a journalist, I'll probably always try once it's safe again to meet people in person, but I do think it will be interesting to see how many sources in the future like sort of ask to just do a Zoom meeting instead of, doing an in-person meeting.
Hmm.
And trying to get to the most like efficient point. I have a feeling a lot of the people that I work with as a healthcare reporter might make some of this Zoom technology and like Zoom type meetings some of their main ways of communicating,
Mhm.
which will be really interesting. But yeah, absolutely, it's definitely a skill. You have to know, when to mute yourself and when to unmute yourself. Well, if you're learning those skills now, that is great technology to have in your back pocket.
Are there any other things that you want to share about sort of your organization or how your world has changed as we've navigated COVID-19, going from not knowing much to knowing a little bit about the virus itself to now moving into this space where we're trying to get vaccinations happening?
Yeah, the other, I guess I didn't really address this earlier, but the running joke in journalism is that no one really gets into journalism for the money, and that's entirely correct. But a big reason people do get into journalism, and myself included, is something called public service and sort of thinking about the power and the freedom of the press as being, being able to provide checks and balances on government, accountability for taxpayer dollars, also informing you when that concert is coming to town. Um, the pandemic has been a really good reminder for me as a journalist, like how vital the information that is pointed to and out there is for people. And, it's not for me right now, my job is not like exposing fraud necessarily, right? Like my job is telling people what time the vaccine clinic is open. And like that can seem really small to some people, right? To like those Pulitzer winning journalists, the blah, 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 blah. But like the pandemic has really um pared down for me that like that public service mission of journalism of like informing the public um of what's happening, what you need to know, and what is good information. That has been not only just like important, I think, to my news organization, but just like important to the public. It's been really interesting and frankly, like sometimes heartbreaking too. Like when people are emailing me, the journalist, and asking me about vaccine stuff, about X, Y, and Z, and it's a humbling reminder that like journalists do have that public service role. Um, in any type of society and community. And a healthy society and community probably has journalism happening in it, for that very reason. So that has been, um, despite all the stress and me like every day trying to unpack what's happening and what's new and eking out the next little volume of this pandemic, it has been rewarding, and I think just a really good humbling reminder for me that sometimes public service is not necessarily doing the hard hitting thing. It might literally just be helping that reader who emailed me who doesn't know how to find the face finder, and counting that as a small victory in public service. Again, not that that's not a career everyone wants to go into. Going back to the flexibility thing, I mean, you really have to be willing to, sometimes that's your win for the day, is, helping that one reader, sending that one reader a link to your story and then saying, hey, like the link in the story for this is right here. Um, but that is sort of something the pandemic has reminded me of, which is like a good career reminder for a lot of journalists, I think.
Yeah, and I think that that flexibility and that adaptability is sort of matched with the like steady push that you're mentioning earlier of trying to like push your industry forward in becoming more diverse, more inclusive, more equitable, which I feel like so many industries got sort of an extra awareness of in 2020. So it's the steadfastness and the flexibility.
Yep, it has to be a combination of the two.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So sort of moving us over to talk about the state of innovation specifically. As you know, we have these three case prompts, one about sort of food chain and getting food to communities, the second about responding to COVID now in every way from wading through information to testing protocol, and then third, thinking about life after COVID. How do we not go back to the old normal, but think about a better normal? And we're encouraging students to really like lean into the messiness of trying to problem solve,
Hmm.
because that is career prep and that is life prep. So knowing that sort of that is the approach that we're taking, knowing that we're aiming for creative solutions that might not be the obvious. Do you have any advice for students, knowing that they could be submitting an essay, a video, a skit, that we're sort of leaving it open how they package things, but we want to see creative solutions to address these prompts?
Absolutely. I think, after reporting on this for a year, I think creative solutions are necessary. And frankly, your generation is going to be saddled with the majority of these problems, which is like super bummer news. And I'm really sorry about that. But, I think 2020 was the horrible pandemic year, but it also, um, from my perspective as a journalist and reporting, it exploited every single crack in our society and system that was all there anyways. But it finally, COVID, if you will, sort of brushed all the dust off and has like held the mirror up to society's face and said, no, no, these are the issues. And I just, to students who are working on these problems, like your answers and your solutions and your creativity is not only valid, it's necessary. Because if we had the answers as a society or a government, we probably wouldn't be in the situation we are right now. On everything from the climate to systemic racism to the pandemic. So, um, there are so many inequities in our current systems, from government to society to just general philosophies that govern our everyday lives, that I think um, looking at how the pandemic affected different people and asking the question why it had to be like that and examining how systems were before the pandemic is really important in order to look forward and be like, hey, we don't need to do that anymore, right? Like, we don't, why are we doing that? And just some examples that come to mind from my perspective is healthcare access. One of the big things right now that's happening is, and that I keep writing, and that I have readers emailing me about, and I think about all the time, is one of the main ways we're connecting people with vaccines is we're telling them to contact their healthcare providers. Well, there are a lot of people, even people that have health insurance, that do not have healthcare providers. Um, and I get emails all the time that are like, "Hey, Arielle, what if I don't have a healthcare provider?" I'm like, "Great question." But that question and that issue is a product of all the decades before of inequity and unequal access to healthcare in this country, in this state, in your community. And another example is who we consider essential workers, right? And what were essential workers faced with pre-pandemic? Were they fighting for wages? Were they fighting for vacation days? Were they fighting for a living wage? Um, how do those how does the pandemic sort of change those conversations and lead to different or better solutions so that we don't go backwards? Those are the questions that I'm thinking about as a journalist all the time. And I think that um, the next generation and students that are just coming up into the world, welcome to adulthood, welcome to the world, you all have to be thinking about them too. And those creative solutions you come up with are vital. I mean, vital, because the adults in charge don't have the answers.
Yeah, and I think it seems like it's also about, like, if something doesn't feel like it's a reasonable answer or like a satisfying answer, it probably isn't, and like dig in further. And again, it goes back to that curiosity. It goes back to like trying to figure out how things work and why. It goes back to trying to understand the relationships that drive things, all these things that you've talked about in our time together. That I feel like a lot of youth are asking, whether it's, asking within the context of a project or just asking as they're seeing headlines, asking as they're navigating life in 2021 of like, why is this happening the way it's happening? Like, that can be a project question. That can be a question that an approach with writing and journalism and reporting can maybe not fully answer, but can start interrogating.
Yep. And I just, even the pandemic itself has again sort of putting that mirror up to society's face. I can't encourage students enough to not, like, you have to keep asking that why. Interrogating systems about why they are the way they are is the only way that someone down the line will look around and be like, yeah, why is the system this way? This doesn't make sense. We're blocking out X amount of people from a healthcare system. Why don't we fix that?
Right.
Um, Oftentimes it's the continuous question, and this is like sort of the painstaking, like not fun part of being a journalist, but it's the journalist who's asking why for sometimes years
Mhm.
before a system changes. But if you can start asking those questions in your everyday life of the systems around you, I think the society and the world will be better off for it, and we need to be with
Right.
so much going on.
Yeah, well, and you talked about how much even just like your world as a journalist has changed during COVID, and it's sort of proof that things can change in an accelerated way. It doesn't have to be the like drip, 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 that like students who are experiencing a different way of learning, a different way of applying to like opportunities for after school, can sort of point to that and say like, this is proof that it doesn't have to be this way because it's always been this way. And it's another way to tie back to the asking questions, the like digging deeper, the doing that research that you're mentioning before, and that it is possible with some resources to do that question asking in 2021, even while we're still quarantined.
Yep, absolutely. And I think the other thing, um, especially on the COVID challenge question, there is a lot of data publicly accessible, um, for just about almost every statistic you would want to know about how the pandemic has affected Washington residents. And I'm happy to provide a couple links after this and whatnot for students who are looking for that type of data, or if you have a hunch or you're like, oh, like the pandemic has really hit this part of my community hard. Is that the case statewide, or is that the case nationally? Um, you know, uh, I joke sometimes that journalism is sort of like being baby scientists. Like we always like ask the question and have a potential hypothesis, but we're always ready to be proved wrong over and over and over again as we go along. Treating your challenge questions like that is really a great way to go about it. And there's some data out there that might surprise you and might absolutely prove you right or prove you wrong, and you'll learn and you'll be better for it.
And I guess maybe to wrap us up, whether it's specific resources or just like types of resources, what would you recommend students refer to for the challenge, but also as they're thinking more about reporting and journalism, and if they're considering a career like yours?
Definitely. I think it's important that you read news from a variety of sources. I cannot stress enough, especially where we're at right now in our country's history and um, just the state of the news industry in general. Read lots of different types of news. You can read websites, you can read your daily paper, you can read your smaller community local paper. Um, if you're interested in journalism and doing journalism, I think it's really important to read journalism that's happening right now. And again, I think seeing different types of journalism and seeing different approaches to journalism will help inform you better as you go along and say, hey, like what questions aren't being asked? Like what stories am I not seeing in these papers that like are definitely happening in communities? Why aren't they writing about this? Um, those are the types of questions that I think make journalists better, but also just make citizens and residents better people in general, asking questions of not only your journalism around you, but also your government and your society and your family too. So I think my best advice is just reading the journalism that's around you in your community, but also, if you're interested in international journalism, read some online journalism from abroad. Um, but yeah, diversify what you're reading and see if there's local opportunities for you to get involved or read a local paper, et cetera, et cetera.
Awesome. Well, thank you. We've learned a lot. We've talked about Arielle's role and what it's like to be a reporter in 2021, and one way to sort of pave a career path to get to that sort of role. We've also gotten some advice from her on approaching the State of Innovation challenges and just exploring the careers in journalism in general. So Arielle, thank you so much for joining us today. And until next time, take care, everyone.
No problem. Thank you.
Bye.